Hi, and welcome to a Small, Medium, at Large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate interviews beyond normal boundaries. I want to thank my daughter Nancy and my son Richard for posting and producing the podcast Small, Medium, at Large for us. And I want to thank you listeners for hanging in. It's 4 years now since we first started, and I want to thank you for subscribing, commenting, liking, sharing, and supporting us. We're at 1,350 subscribers now on YouTube, and we love seeing you on all the regular social media sites like Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all other sites. So let me tell you about our special guest today. Dean Radin is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which we also call IONS. He is the Associated Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and co-founder and vice chairman of the neuroengineering company Cognigenics. He earned an MS in electrical engineering and a PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In 2022, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Science from the Swami Vivekananda University in Bangalore, India. Before joining the IONS research staff in 2001, Dean Radin had been working at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He has given over 780 talks and interviews worldwide, and he's an inventor with 8 patents and author or co-author of over 340 scientific and popular articles, book chapters, and books, 4 of which have been translated into 15 foreign languages. The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, Real Magic, and coming out this fall in 2025, Enchantment. I want to share one quote. It's a little bit of a paragraph here from Dean's bio that I was especially excited to read about. So here's Dean's words, and then we'll bring Dean on to you today. My interest in psi phenomena was not motivated by personal experiences. Instead, it was sparked by curiosity and an intuitive sense that the mind is far more mysterious and powerful than is taught in academia. Over many years of study and experimentation, I have come to appreciate that psi experiences are not just weird anomalies. They're responsible for the greatest inventions, artistic and scientific achievements, creative insights, and religious epiphanies throughout history. Understanding this realm of human experience is thus far more than of academic interest. It touches on the very best that the human intellect and spirit have had to offer. I discovered while working on these topics, that I enjoy the challenges of exploring the frontiers of science, and I am comfortable tolerating the ambiguity of not knowing the right answer, which is a constant companion at the edges of the known. After exploring these phenomena through the lens of science for over 4 decades, conducting and publishing dozens of controlled experiments, reading the extensive historical and contemporary scientific literature, and working at or visiting nearly all of the active psi laboratories around the world, I've concluded that psychic abilities are real. This is important because it means there are key assumptions within the prevailing scientific worldview that are either incomplete or flatly wrong. So let's welcome our returning guest here today, Dean Radin, who was in our first podcast when we started in 2021. Welcome, Dean. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So tell me, Dean, you are the chief scientist for over 20 years at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS. What does the word noetic mean, and what does the Institute do? And this is for some of our listeners who may be just hearing about you and the Institute for the first time today.
Noetic is a term which, in its broadest sense, means deep knowing or intuitive knowing or insight. It includes psychic phenomena, mystical experiences suggestive of survival of bodily death. All of those anomalies from a conventional perspective that are subsumed under that one term. But probably the closest in the vernacular would be something like intuition.
So what does the Institute do?
Well, we're noetic sciences because we use the tools and techniques of science to try to understand those experiences. Generally, what we can study in the laboratory are psychic experiences, telepathy, precognition, and so on, because they're amenable to being studied using scientific methods. Other phenomena, like what is reported in mediumship, are also can be studied in the laboratory, but only to the extent that we can confirm that what a medium says about a deceased person is correct, that the information is correct, but we can't tell whether their experience of a deceased person means that there actually is a deceased person.
Hmm.
That there's no way at this point to tell from a scientific perspective that there are in fact deceased persons out there who are still alive in some fashion. But anything that can be studied under controlled circumstances in the laboratory, that's more or less we study all of it. That's what we do.
It's a very exciting institute, and I'm thrilled for the years I got to spend some time there as well. Miss that you're not in Petaluma anymore. So, what's the process of turning questions about consciousness and reality into an experimental design? Like, are you in the shower and you're all of a sudden something comes to you and you say, oh, wow, this is how we could do this? I know that there's experiments that you replicate, like, say, the Gans field, but what happens when you come up with, say, the one I want to talk about next, called the SIGIL, which I think is something you created in your laboratory and it has not been done. So I'm curious, how do you come up with this? Or do you look for,
Mm. What I generally do is get these ideas in dreams. And
ah,
so, and I somehow I recognized when I wake up that it was an unusual dream. Because most of my dreams are like reflections of something I saw on TV or something like that. These have a different quality to them. And generally, the quality is such that I know that if I do the experiment, it will work. So is it precognition? I don't know what it is, but that's generally where these come from. And also, in thinking back of the kinds of experiments I've done, none of them that I can think of are actually unique or even original. So the
mhm,
sigil experiment is not an original idea. The idea of testing magicians is maybe a new idea. I don't know of anybody who's explicitly done that before in an experiment involving mind-matter interaction. But most of the ideas that I come up with are variations on something that I read that somebody had tried previously. And then it's, as we find anywhere in science, you make advancements beyond what other people have done. And if you're lucky, you make an advancement that turns out to be a really good advancement. So I've been lucky enough to do that. But so far, I can't think of hardly anything that I've done that is truly original.
mhm.
But
Well,
that's okay. I mean, as long as what I'm doing seems to work, and that's good enough for me.
so there's something that I'm learning right now as you're telling me this, that you're getting this from dreams. It's making me think about something about dreams and the subconscious, because when I get information in dreams, I'm not a scientist, so I never get any of those kind of things. I get information like somebody's going to die, or someone's going to be born, or something's going to happen, or I should do certain thing, because that's really where I operate. So my
Right.
subconscious dream is giving me information because that's where I'm coming from. You're coming from a scientific point of view and you're getting information from your dreams relating to science. So
Well, yeah,
dreams are very important.
yeah. I mean, and it's not too surprising because I spend a lot of time in waking hours thinking about an experiment or something I want to try, and then part of my mind is continuing to think about it while dreaming, and occasionally comes up with a good idea that I remember.
Well, tell me about First of all, I know it's called the SIGIL experiment, and I was wondering what SIGIL stand for, what SIGIL stands for, and what was your hypothesis for this SIGIL experiment, SIGIL?
Right. So the acronym is SIGIL. It's scientific investigation of gazing with intuition at light. And sometimes instead of the word intuition, I have the word intention.
Mm-hmm.
Scientific investigation of gazing with intention at light. Sigil is also a word in the magical traditions, which means symbol, and it's a symbol that stands for an intention. Like you draw a sigil, it's an intention.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of this experiment was a continuation of studies I've been doing since 2008, which are addressing an open question in quantum mechanics on the role of the observer. Now, the quantum observer effect is a well-known effect. It is not understood very well. If you ask any group of physicists, you'll get very confident answers that we know exactly what it is. But the truth of the matter is that nobody understands why it is that when you observe or measure a quanta, it changes its behavior. So that is the quantum observer effect. So the easiest way of seeing this, and this is physics 101, is with a double slit optical system. So you shoot photons through two tiny little slits, and then you have a camera at the other end that measures what is the pattern of light that is produced. So the pattern of light through a double slit will produce alternating bands of light and dark. So that's simply the interference pattern that is producing. And that pattern is almost identical to what you would get if you were shooting water through not two tiny slits, but two slits and pushing water through it. What you would see is a ripply pattern that would end up with crests and troughs, which would be corresponding to what you see in photons. You see bright and dark bands. So suggests that there's something about the quantum wave function, and it's called wave function because it's operating kind of like waves, like water waves. The mystery here is that if you're shooting a single photon at the two slits, and you have a detector that can detect which of the two slits it goes through, then the wave patterns go away and you end up with what's called a particulate pattern, as though somehow the act of knowing which of the two slits it goes through is causing the wave to go away, and now it's acting like a particle. Well, why is that? So a conventional explanation is that if you have a photon that hits a detector, the interaction with the detector is the reason why the wave-like potential element of a photon is suddenly transformed into a particle because of that interaction. This is like the way that many physicists would think about this. The problem with that explanation is that there's experiments and thought experiments that illustrate that it's not the interaction, it's not only the interaction with the detector, but so-called negative measurement experiments. And one way to explain this is that if you have two slits and you have a detector behind one of them, and you shoot a single photon, and that detector does not see anything, but it does hit the screen, then you know that it must have gone through the other slit, because it has to go through one or the other. That's called a negative measurement because there was no detection of which of the two slits it went through, but you know that it had to go through the other one. And so when you have that kind of setup, and you look at the interference pattern every time that it goes through the slit where there was no detection, it still looks like a particle. Well, why is that? It wasn't because it interacted with anything, because it didn't hit anything. And nevertheless, it still acts like a particle. So there is something about your knowledge of what happened when it went through the two slits. You can infer that it went through the one where there was no detection. So it's your knowledge that has to do with it. And this is why it's so mysterious, because like what knowledge? Who's having the knowledge here? It seems as though it is something possibly about consciousness. Like what do you know? That makes a difference. And so when you look at the history of the founders of quantum mechanics, and we're trying to figure out then why is that? So you have people like John von Neumann, who was a super genius, and Eugene Wigner, another super genius, all of them in the big founders of quantum mechanics. They said there's something that must be non-physical that is causing these particles, which are physical, to transition from quantum potentials into classical actuals. That's the way they would put it, from potential to actual. What is it? Well, it's a psychophysical effect. What that means is consciousness, knowing, something knowing is the thing that does the transition.
So would that be right for me to say in a simple term that uh, this is showing that something invisible is affecting something material?
Well, something invisible,
Well,
something,
because
I would say
consciousness
rather
or thought,
something not, something apparently non-physical is
right,
affecting something
non-physical.
that is physical. Yes.
Yes. And so then technically a scientist can't say that this isn't happening when you're actually physically seeing the photon changing into the particles.
Right. The underlying question is, well, why did that happen from a scientific perspective? So, well, something happened. We don't, why did that happen? So anyway, so the SIGIL experiment is following up on almost 15 years of prior experiments, lots of experiments that we've done and that have been replicated by others now, which suggests that it is the act of consciously knowing something about what the photons are doing that is sufficient to cause the photons to behave like particles rather than waves. So that would support what von Neumann and Wigner had said, that there's something non-physical interacting with these physical systems in some way. So the sigil experiment, I designed that to make a much, much simpler version of that experiment. Because if you are using a double slit system, it's quite expensive to make one and to analyze the results. And then you kind of need a laboratory in order to do that experiment properly. So I came up with an idea based on somebody else who had this idea that you can use a diffraction pattern. It's a transparent piece of plastic that has 500 lines per millimeter. So it's very, very closely spaced lines, kind of like a double slit, except lots of them. And if you shine a laser through that, what you get are discrete points of light. It's no longer a band of brighter and darker, but several points of light. The center point is where the beam goes directly through this transparent um, grating. And so that's kind of like the particulate form of light, it's because it's passing straight through. But there's two little dots on either side of that, and two more dots and two more dots. The two dots on either side of the central dot are bright enough so that you can see them. By the time you get out to the second, what's called the second order dots, they're pretty dim. Third order dots you can't see anymore. So I simply put a detector behind the zero order dot, which is the one in the center, and one detector on each side of the first order dots. The first order dots only exist because of the wave nature of light. So if you're getting information, if you're extracting information somehow through your mind, then the amount of light going into these dots on the side will go down because you're causing it to collapse into particles. So that became a very simple way of doing the analysis. That's what I built this little box, which is doing this. Yeah,
In
you
fact, I can
probably have the
show,
box right there.
I'll show the little box right here so everyone can see it.
Yeah,
Buddha on top, and
a
then
little
here
Buddha.
is the little light,
Right.
little right there.
Yeah. So I made 50 of those. I found 50 people around the world who, because of the way that they answered questions about their practice, and in particular, half of the people were primarily meditators, and the other half could be meditators too, but they also did magical practices. So the idea here was that meditators, especially those who primarily do meditation, it's an inward form of attention. It's attention training that's kind of focused inside. Whereas magical practices, especially those doing sigils or spell casting, the intention and the attention is outward, trying to change something in the outside world. So half were magicians, half were meditators. And overall, if you look at all of the data in the experiment, it wasn't significant because I was hoping to see that the illumination level would go down. But when I only looked at the magicians, there was a significant effect, and that was based on a pre-registered form of analysis. So it's the first time that I know of where people were selected because they have an outward form of attention and intention, where those actually did show the effect that I had pre-registered. And then they did a exploratory analysis where rather than looking at all of the data combined, I looked at, as you know, that you for 30 seconds you would concentrate on the output of the system, and then 30 seconds you would withdraw your attention. So during the attention toward part of it, the concentration, you'd see a graph and you'd see a line in the graph. And during the relaxed period, there was no graph at all. So your interaction with the system is through that feedback system. So I said, well, what was happening during the 30 seconds when people were attending towards the system as compared to when they were not attending towards the system?
Mhm.
Did it make any difference? Yeah, it made a huge difference. I hadn't predicted that in advance because I didn't do this experiment before. I didn't know what was going to happen. But there was a huge difference. In addition, the feedback was based on only one of those two dots, one of the two first order dots. The other dot was then a continuous control dot because you never got any feedback about what was going on there. So did it make a difference when you were seeing feedback from one of the dots? Yeah, a big effect. What about the dot that you had no feedback on? There was no effect. So it provides a secondary way of showing that it really was your connection to one of the points of light and not the other one, which means that the interference was collapsing sort of in that direction, but it
Mhm.
wasn't affecting the other one. So I'm going to follow this up with another experiment to look at that again, because if that is true, that's almost good enough to be used as a technology. Because now we're able to say it's not simply that the wave-like structure of light is collapsing, but it collapses differentially in the direction of what you're looking at. Now we're looking at with your mind, but nevertheless, it's creating a distortion in the interference pattern. That's what it looks like. A distortion is arising. Well, if that is really true, then you could send messages with this thing. You just think about this thing from a distance, and you can detect that because of the distortion that would occur in the interference pattern. So I'm going to try that in the next round of experiments. And rather than making a whole bunch of these boxes, which took forever because they were all handmade, I'm going to do it over the internet. So people will participate in the same kind of experiment, but online.
But
And then,
online.
and by doing that, I can make one box, which is a much better box than the ones that I made when I sent them out, because I didn't have enough money to spend a huge amount of money on each box.
Mhm. Well, uh, having been a participant in one of the 50 people in that experiment, I want to say that I got a lot out of it because it was teaching me something about my intention and my focus. And at one point, I was wondering if I had broken the box, or maybe why was it doing this? Why was it staying with the light white? And so I decided other tricks that I would do to see what really actually worked. And it really showed me about when I was in like my most uh I don't know, sharp or sparkly or whatever place, I would have very good connection with the box. If I was more unfocused and kind of not centered and not in that kind of a space, then I wouldn't be able to get it to turn on to the white light or keep the white light on. But what I liked about what that was seeing how I was functioning and how it was affecting the box. So it was giving me a feedback and a teaching at the same time as participating in the experiment itself. And there was also something that you hadn't mentioned, but there was sound that also came out. So that, because I found I didn't like to look at the graph, because I like to keep my eyes closed when I'm doing intention or focus like that. So I never saw what the graph was doing, but the sound I could hear then. And so it was very validating and supportive knowing you were hitting it correct when you heard the loud sound.
Right.
So you found then that the people that had signed up using more of a magical type um, uh, answers to their questions, that they're more following that kind of thing, those did actually a little better than the ones where they were all meditators.
They did significantly better. Yep.
Any idea why?
Well, as I said, their practice is to focus their attention outwards,
Got it. So
right?
that,
So which makes sense given that the target in this case was outside of themselves. It wasn't something on the inside.
mhm.
So yeah, so well, and when I follow this up, the experiment will probably be open to everybody because it'll be online. But I'll have a questionnaire to try to get at the kinds of practices that people have, because I then predict that people who have an outward focus of attention, whether they think of that as manifestation or magic or something like that, doesn't really matter. I can predict that they will do better than people who do a more conventional form of meditation where they're focusing inwards.
Inward. So it really proved that the outward people who practice doing outward had an easier access to making the box turn white, the
Yeah,
light.
what you're mentioning here, since I didn't talk about it, is that there was a multicolor LED on the
Hmm.
box, which changed colors from a very dim green. Well, first of all, it could be off, or it could be dim green, or bright green, or white, which reflected how well the interference was changing in the box. So in the sense, the goal was to make the LED turn white, or to get the sound as loud as you could, or if you're looking at a graph, to make the graph go up. So three forms of feedback.
Well, I want to continue practicing again with it. I haven't used it for a while, and I really enjoyed I felt like I was having a relationship with the box. So I was really enjoying learning from it. Um, what so you answered my question about whether further investigations will be done. Will this be published in a peer-reviewed journal, or is a paper being written about this
Yeah,
particular
the
experiment?
article describing this is quite a long article, has been accepted in the journal Physics Essays, and I've already sent back the galley proof, so it'll come out probably in the beginning of March 2025.
And probably in March.
Yeah.
Okay, so I hope to see a copy of that. So I've got one, two, three, I've got five other questions. I feel like we've covered SIGIL pretty good. Do we feel good about that?
Yeah.
And we know that this in the future that other participants can take a look online and be able to participate in this study, and I highly suggest they do.
Mhm.
What would you consider your most important work that you've done? Because your accomplishments and your bio is incredible. And each time I read it, David and I both go, wow, we didn't know he did that. Oh, and he was making an AI thing. Oh, he would do. So you've done so many things. And I do want to ask about your new company next. So I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the most important work you've done, but that's what I'm just wondering if there's any experiment or book or thing or whatever in your life that you feel has been really a really important thing.
Well, first of all, I think of it as so far,
Right.
because, right, I'm still active in doing this kind of research. Um, I would say maybe the work I did on presentiment, which is a physiological form of precognition. So there were some people in the 70s who were doing similar kinds of experiments. This is an example then of how I've tried to advance the state of the art. Um, what happens is sometimes if somebody comes up with a new kind of experiment and they publish it, and then you never hear anything about it ever again. So that was an example. In this case, somebody tried an experiment where they're looking at a certain kind of brain response to see if it would show a precognitive effect before stimulus. And it showed kind of weak effects, and so nobody paid any attention to it. Well, I remember reading about that and thinking, well, The psychic effects, when you try to evoke it in the laboratory, seem to be a lot better if there's some motion that is related to it, and the emotion pushes motivation to want to connect with something. So I created a version of this experiment where you would see calm pictures or emotional pictures, and we'd be recording your physiology to see whether before an emotional picture you would become emotional, even not knowing what the future was going to be, and before a calm picture you'd remain calm. So I tried that experiment first and published it in 1996, and the results were like astoundingly good. So I
Mm.
presented it at a conference, and my colleagues were there, and they're saying, "Well, this is ridiculous. Like, this is way too good." So fortunately, that motivated one of my colleagues in the Netherlands to immediately go back to his lab and try to replicate it, and he got the same results.
Wow.
Well, since then, there have been something like 4 dozen experiments being replicated by lots of people. Overall, there's no question that this presentiment effect is a real thing, that your physiology, which is reflecting your unconscious mind, is showing that anywhere between about a half a second and 9 seconds in advance of seeing an emotional versus calm picture, or not even a picture, sometimes just a sound or a feeling or something, that between a half a second in brain response and 9 seconds in heart rate, you will respond appropriately for what that future stimulus is going to be. And so because it's been replicated so many times now, it has more or less confirmed my intuition when I thought about doing this experiment early on, that yeah, if you have a way of measuring unconscious physiological responses, you get much, much stronger effects than if you ask somebody to consciously report something.
Now, I did that experiment a bunch of different times, and I
Mhm.
also did it for, I think it was Daryl Bem. I'm not sure now, but he was doing one where the photos would all be sexual or sensual or stimulate that.
Right.
And then I did ones in the beginning with you that had some incredible, scary auto accident victims and like that kind of a intense emotion.
Yeah.
Did you find that, say, the sensual emotion photos or the car accident victims with the eyeball hanging out? Actually, some of them I can still remember. Did either of these, were either of these stronger? Like, were the sensual ones a stronger response than, say, the more frightening car accident kind of things?
It depended on gender. So
Oh,
for men, in general, this is not true, but for specifics, but for in general, men and women would respond differently. Men would respond very strongly to the erotic pictures. Women would respond stronger to the what are called violent pictures.
interesting.
So it sort of matches a sociological difference they'd expect with men and women. Um, So, which is a secondary way of if it makes sense
Hmm.
because of the way that men and women generally respond to these things, well, and you're getting a significant effect in both cases. If it matches with your expectations about the sociological effect, that's actually good because it means that whatever is going on here is partially being influenced by what society expects us to, or what we simply respond to differently. So yeah, so there do seem to be differences, and my colleague Julia Mossbridge has done many more experiments of this type, and specifically focusing on gender effects, and she too has found that men and women respond differently in this kind of experiment along the lines of what I was saying.
One interesting thing about that experiment was when I would do it, there was nothing to do. You
Right,
just sat there and I mean, I would try to feel what my body was feeling, but really everything was coming from my own bodily response that I don't really have necessarily control over.
right.
So was it your heart rate? What was tested? Your heart
When
rate,
when when you're doing it is primarily with skin conductance.
skin conductance.
Yeah. And it's true. The reason why that experiment gives a larger effect is because your conscious mind is not interfering with it.
Right.
As you know, if you're in an experiment and you kind of have a on-demand effect, be psychic now, well, most people
Right.
can't do that. And in which case their conscious mind tries to figure out the right answer and it gets in the way. So by
Mhm.
taking advantage of a very simple experiment where you're just sitting there looking at pictures, your unconscious definitely knows what's going on, and that's what we can pick up.
And science should respect those experiments because they're physiological. It's fact. It's showing you scientific
Right.
results of the body right
Yeah.
there.
And most of those studies have been published in mainstream journals.
Hmm.
It's not clear. The reason why it's not considered super mainstream at this point is because it suggests that some aspect of your awareness can perceive through time. And so we don't have very good theories yet. We have sort of quasi theories in science as to how you could see through time, but it's considered controversial enough that people might read it and be interested. And we know that people are interested because of the number of times that the articles have been looked at,
Hmm.
hundreds of thousands of times. And yet, because we haven't caught up yet in the scientific world as to exactly why you would expect to see that result. And this is true for all of these psychic effects, that the empirical facts are way ahead of theoretical explanations.
Well, I was thinking it was going to be, I would never imagine that that was going to be the one you'd pick of all the
What
things.
would you pick?
I wasn't sure if it was going to be something to do with, genetics and these other things, which is my next question. Uh, 4 years ago, you mentioned a new company. I think I'm not sure if it was just beginning then or if it'd been around a little bit. And I believe you call it Cognigenics. Is that the proper pronunciation?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about it and what it's doing now? That was what I thought might have been your.
Oh, well, that the psychic side of that is not settled yet. There are inklings that there are genetic differences in people with high sight talent versus no talent at all. And this is based on folklore, that virtually every culture has folklore that psychic ability runs in families, sometimes skips a generation, but nevertheless it runs in families, which suggests that there's some kind of genetic basis to it. So a number of years ago, we did a small study called a case control study where we got DNA from people who were psychic from psychic families and DNA from people who had never reported anything psychic and nor did anyone in their family. And then you do a genetic analysis to see if there's any difference between the two. And we did find a difference. The
Oh.
difference in the DNA, this was we call our SIGINs project. The difference was not in the coding portion of the DNA, but in the non-coding portion. So if you look at the number of base pairs in DNA, it's billion or some number of billions. The number of pairs that contribute to the creation of proteins in the body were made up out of proteins is relatively small. It's only about 50,000 of this some number of billions of base pairs. And in between the coding portions, there's this called the exon. There's this portion called the intron, meaning it's between the exons. It doesn't code for protein. And for a long time, people said, well, what is that? It's like junk. We don't even know what that is, like some kind of sticky stuff that just holds it together. It turns out it's way more important than that. This
Oh.
intron sequence is related to epigenetics. It's related to what genes are turned on versus not turned on, and which is in turn related to what proteins are made or how they are made. So that's where we found this difference, that there was a difference between the psychics and the non-psychics in this intron sequence, which was unexpected, but that's what we got. So we recently did a second type of experiment where we got the DNA from 23andMe and from Ancestry.com. And
That's
we
what I
asked
was
people a
thinking.
bunch of questions. And we used a statistical method to see whether there was any relationship between what we found in their DNA, or at least for this exon and intron sequence, and the answers that they gave to psychic experiences. And again, we found a difference. So thinking back now, the Cognigenics, we formed that 5 years ago, but it was around the time that we were working on the SIGINs. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting if we could create some sort of a cocktail that you would give to somebody to turn them into a talented psychic temporarily. Well, we didn't know if that was possible at the time, but that was one of the origins for my interest in this idea. Could you create some sort of treatment that would do this? So we came up with an intranasal delivery of genetic edits, initially using CRISPR, which is a DNA edit, and then later using RNA, which would be a temporary edit. And so we didn't want to use CRISPR for actual humans because it would do a permanent change to your brain, which we thought would probably not something that people would want. But RNA would be a temporary change. And again, intranasal delivery. So you basically snort this stuff, it goes into your brain, and then it changes certain receptors in the brain. Well, we didn't think, we don't know enough yet to be able to do this for psychic phenomena. But we did know enough to make a treatment that would reduce anxiety and increase memory at the same time.
Wow.
So we've done many tests with mice and rats, and we know that it works in them. It does significant reduction of anxiety, significant improvement in memory. And so we know that it works in human neurons because we've done it in vitro. And so we're moving ahead and want to do clinical trials to mainly target early onset Alzheimer's, because
Wow.
that is associated both with an increase in anxiety and a decrease in memory. And once that progression begins, we don't have any treatments at all. Nothing that
Right.
we have, even a few that have been approved by the FDA, a $50,000 treatment will slow down the progression by 2 months for
Oh,
$50,000. It doesn't cure anything. It
that's
doesn't even stop it. It just slows it down. So we think that the method that we're using, which is targeting the reason why these problems occur, especially in older age, is because of hyperactivity in the brain. So some neurons start firing just too much, and it creates hyperactivity, which in turn creates what's called excitotoxicity. If they're firing too much, it creates a toxicity in the brain, and that eventually degrades the ability to have memories and increases anxiety, and it does about a bunch of things you don't want to do. So it's targeting in general this idea of neurodegeneration, that the older you get, the less and less efficient your brain becomes. And what our treatment does is it reverses that. So we think that in humans, we can't tell in mice because it's hard to test these kinds of subjective effects in mice, but we can test whether memory improved of 100% in
mhm.
mice, and also that anxiety decreased. So if we see the same effects in humans, which we'll only know when we do clinical trials, that will provide a way of either stopping, possibly curing, although we don't know at this point, this neurodegeneration, which leads to chronic anxiety and a loss of memory, which would be great. So that's what our commercial product is about. But behind it is, again, this interest I have in pulling together some sort of treatment that would cause somebody who doesn't have psychic talent to suddenly have it, because we will learn enough by then to be able to figure out what kind of receptors or connectomes in the brain, what kind of regions in the brain are different in somebody who has psychic talent versus not.
And then when you're saying that, are you talking about psychic talent where they've trained themselves, or are you talking about psychic talent where it's just natural that they've just always been that way?
Natural.
So I'd love to take that DNA test if you need. I've been to a 23andMe.
Yeah. Well, so you're like the prototype of somebody who's a natural talent. You didn't train yourself to do this.
Yeah.
That's who you are. Well, it suggests that there's something different about the way that your brain is put together. There'll be other differences as well. It has to do with your upbringing and expectations and all kinds of things. But almost certainly at this point, it looks like there's a difference in your DNA. The way that you process information is different. And so you can see a couple of personality differences here. Like most people have a pretty good sensor in terms of the way that they perceive the world. There's all these filters that we're always filtering things out. Some of it is conscious censoring. Others will be unconscious censoring. So whatever all of those filters are, you have less of them. They're more transparent than
Mm-hmm.
most people. So you're seeing the world closer to the way it probably really is, which, as best as we can tell, is fully interconnected through space and time. You're like connected to everything all the time, but you're still able to remain grounded for reasons we don't quite understand. Because if you imagine that somebody was fully open to everything, but they're not that grounded and they can't really filter it too much, they're going to be diagnosed as schizophrenic.
That's one of the qualities about myself that I've always found very interesting, that I'm incredibly responsible, organized person that can manage an unbelievable amount of real estate or things or whatever. And then on the other end, I could go into some kind of a, experience where I'm seeing something that's happening to another person at a distance.
Yep.
And that could happen at the same time while I'm at Home Depot picking up a bunch of plywood.
Yeah, because part of your mind is everywhere all at once. So
Yes.
so then it becomes quite interesting to figure out, well, it's probably related in some way to a brain difference. Like our perception of reality is very tightly related to how our brain is processing that information. So it's not too surprising that even somebody who's not talented in non-ordinary states of awareness, like dreaming, like I get stuff in dreams, but I
Mhm.
usually don't in a conscious level at all. So, and it's something about when conscious awareness comes back in, you wake up, my brain has all kinds of filters that come into play automatically.
Right.
Maybe it's necessary because I do a lot of analytical work and, I don't want to be distracted by what's going on in Jupiter at the moment.
Hmm.
Whereas if you can make the decision that, you know what, I want to find out what's happening on Jupiter, and you can just do that. Well, that's kind of unusual.
I uh I have always been so excited about all of the different experiments that have come out of ions, and I've been very thrilled to participate in them. And I have three small little questions, so it won't take up much more of your time because I'm trying to keep us at an hour. You've been in over 40 films and documentaries. And I was wondering, do you have any exciting projects in the film or documentary area that's coming up that our audience can look forward to? Like, is there a Netflix thing coming up or some things that, because I know you've done a lot of different amazing, either you've consulted or you've, written. I think you were working last time we spoke 4 years ago. I think you were working on, um, maybe it was science fiction or I can't
Yeah,
remember.
yeah, a screenplay for a pilot science fiction show.
Hmm.
So the more recently, I've been engaged as a scientific consultant for a TV series, a science fiction series that would be roughly based on the government Stargate program of remote viewing for espionage. Um, and so there is a possibility that um, IONS might become an investor in that film. And what that means, or not a film, but a series. What that
Hmm.
means is that you develop a series by creating a pilot script, which I've already consulted on, and then a long story arc, which would cover like an entire season. And then you make visuals and stuff, and you create a package that you then present to a streaming service. So it
Hmm.
would have a star, and you would have a director, and you have the story, and you have the visuals, and all that stuff. So that becomes a package. So then you hope that a streaming service like Netflix will say, "Oh, this looks good, and looks like it'll work." And then they give you the big bucks, which are required to actually start shooting the show. So IONS might be involved because the development of all of this, the development of the pitch requires a certain amount of money. And so maybe that would happen, in which case I would become an executive producer, not just a consulting producer, but an executive producer. And what that would do is allow me the ability to approve scripts. And the
Good.
reason why that's important is because IONS as an organization might become part of that story. So you can have a fictional story and actually refer back to actual real things in the real world. And so we're thinking, we don't know yet whether this is something that the board will approve, but if it does, well, then part of my job at IONS will be to work on this TV show, which would be a
That would,
lot of fun.
it would be a lot of fun, very exciting. And I want to mention that I just had Marilyn Schlitz on our show, and she talked about her book, Love Study. And when I read the book from cover to cover a night and a half before I had her on the show, so it was as fresh as can be in my mind. And when I'm reading it, I kept thinking, why would a woman who's done so many books with and papers on research and scientific things and everything's academic, and she has, like in the book, she's a brainiac, a brilliant woman, why would she switch to the novel idea? And I really enjoyed the novel idea, realizing that it could reach so many other people that normally would not be reached because they steer away from anything that might be psychic or experimental or any of these kind of things. But when they're reading a novel, or if they're watching a show that you're going to produce that's going to have a combination of fiction and reality in there, it's more of a way, I think, for the general population to be able to open up a little more to all these possibilities. So I think it's a great thing. And I think a show would be, especially on the streaming on Netflix or whichever one, it would be fantastic.
Yeah. So, but part of my reason for doing this is because first of all, I'm a big science fiction fan, always have been. But as you said, that we're doing really well if we reach a few thousand people when we talk about one of our science studies or research studies. This would be a way of reaching 20 million people
Right.
through entertainment, but at the same time inject as best as we can scientific realism into the story. So I thought, well, I mean, besides it just being fun, it's much, much more fun to write a fictional piece because you're not constrained by all of the details you have to do when you do a scientific report. To be able to reach all those people would be an educational process. But I mean, what's better than something that's both entertaining and educational at the same time?
And it's also, some people may never have been exposed when you put in some of the ideas there, whether it's presentiment or seeing things at a distance or whatever it is, that may never have occurred to them. And that can stimulate their ability to open up and maybe accept it from when it's coming at them from somebody that's telling them a real story.
Right. So the other reason I'm interested in the stories is because the way that psychic phenomena are portrayed in entertainment is almost always in horror. Like almost everyone that I know of, it devolves into horror at some point.
No, I was asked by someone, you had sent me someone that was looking for something. And when I answered the things, it was all about turning it into a horror thing. And I said, oh, no, that's not me. I said, I wouldn't be able to participate in that. I don't have things to
Yeah.
make it.
Well,
Instead of,
but that's how Hollywood thinks about these topics. And so I'm interested in changing that narrative and saying, no, it's not horrific. It's simply a part of human experience that we don't understand very well, and it has all kinds of positive effects as well. So that's why I wanted to agreed to be a consultant on this TV series so I can help change the narrative on this and say, no, this is actually pretty interesting. It says something about the nature of who we are and what we're capable of without automatically having to become a horror
right.
show.
And that, and also I find that whenever they represent a psychic, often in these, they're kind of wild, crazy look, or they they don't look like a regular person. They make them look kind of like they're out there. So it would be nice for that to be set up where they can see that it's regular people, everyday people you're standing with in the grocery store.
Yeah.
So I have two last questions, and I think they shouldn't be too long. One is, I just wonder if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about your new book coming out this fall called Enchantment, A Scientific Guide to Practical Magic. And then my last question is just about a call for participants. So that one's a quickie.
Well, so the book title, that was my title, but the editor is thinking maybe a different title, and I'm not exactly sure why she didn't like my title, but
I
so it
like
it
it.
may or may not be called Enchantment. It might be she was thinking about the title, The Science of Magic. Yeah, I didn't really like that much. I liked Enchantment better.
Me
So
too.
we don't know yet what the title will be.
Because when we see enchantment, we're not sure what is he writing about.
Yeah.
That to me, that was the exciting part about it,
Yeah, I wanted something that was intriguing and not something that was like in your face.
right.
So anyway, so I don't know what we're going to settle on. I told her I didn't particularly like that title. So also it was too trite. It's like it's anyway. So but this is I have to rely on the marketing people at the publishing company because they know they at least think they know.
I think they know, but
Yeah,
sometimes
they
they
think they
don't.
know what people want, and so anyway.
Well, is this like a sequel to Real
Yeah.
Magic
Yeah,
or
it's a follow-up to Real Magic, and partly it's to bring the empirical data up to date because it's better. I wrote
Mhm.
the previous book in 2017, so we're already well beyond that. And it's also to point out that the paradigms in science have were beginning to change, but now are very clearly have changed in the direction where what scientists, an increasing number of scientists believe about the nature of reality is shifting, and it's
Mhm.
shifting in the direction that's more and more compatible with the reality of these phenomena. So we don't see major paradigm shifts in science very often. This is one that's currently underway. And so I spent a fair amount of time talking about why this shift is happening and what is it and how it's going to make a difference. And then the last third of the book is talking about what scientific practices are. So I talk about a half a dozen different methods that people use primarily in enchantment. That's exactly why I wanted the book to be called that, because you could do the same thing for divination, you could do it for lots of other areas, but this is mainly about what in the vernacular we'd call spell casting. Like what do people do? And so that I talked about that.
Oh, I just have to share this quickly with you. Uh, we have a friend down in Santa Barbara, our dear friend Barry Morrow, and he was the screenplay writer of The Rain Man. And I went down to visit, we were down to visit, and he wanted to show us, and I think it was called Enchantment. He made a new film a few years ago that he filmed in, I think it was Italy, and it's all the whole idea of the story is that a person goes and spends a night in the barn in this farm in Italy, but when they wake up the next day, they're another person. They become like an enchantment of love or something on them, so that the first person or animal they see when they come out of that, when they wake up in the morning, they fall in love with. And there's a whole, so like the most unattractive woman of the village that no one would ever want came to the door when one of the men woke up from this, and he's chasing her around the village continually because he has to marry her.
Yeah.
And no one can figure out that the enchantment had come because of if you go into this building, something happens, it's filled with some kind of enchantment spell. And when you came out, you're a different person. And it was such, so he showed us we got to see the preview. I don't know if it was released in Europe or where the film came out, but it was such a wonderful, positive kind of a theory with no special effects really, but the whole idea that an enchantment could change a person to be in complete love. And so it was a
Yeah.
very positive, upbeat thing. So I just want to ask you the last question to our audience because they're things that they might want if there's something you can spell out. Can you tell our listeners how they find the site to see if IONS needs participants in experiments? And are there any experiments coming up that you can tell us about now that they are looking for people to sign up.
Yeah, and so I'm going to look it up here and make sure I get it right.
Okay, and that would be my last question.
Yeah, so we do have an experiment that we're recruiting people for on telepathy, and I think it's here. Yeah, so the page, it's we go to noetic.org, and then you can search under science. It's a tab, and then under that is one called participate in research. So that one lists several different programs that are currently underway, and then you can volunteer for those.
And let's tell our audience, noetic.org would be spelled NOETIC.org.
Right.
And
And
then,
most of these, you would send an email if you wanted to research@noetic.org and
mhm.
ask about these or other. I mean, maybe you'd want to volunteer for an experiment, and maybe we have something going, or maybe we're planning something. So that's how you do it.
And that's a wonderful thing for especially people living in countries not in the United States, a way to be able to participate in these scientific things. It's a wonderful thing. I also want to mention that there's also the site called GotPsi, GOTPSI, is that .org as well?
Yep.
And that's a wonderful place where, could you just explain what's on the site?
Sci is a suite of simple psi tasks, all of which, with one exception maybe, are precognition tasks. So they involve selecting something that the computer will then select afterwards. So you're trying to guess what is about to happen, or what is the target that the computer is going to select. So there's a half a dozen of them. A few years ago, we significantly revised that the program to bring them up to speed in terms of modern computing methods. So you
Mhm.
have a registration process, and you have a password, and all of that usual stuff that you have. The original one I wrote actually in 2000, so it's quite a long time ago. And so we've been slowly analyzing the data. We have 300 million trials that have been collected over that period of time from about a third of a million people.
Wow, I actually started that in somewhere in 2000 and I had so much fun with it. My goal was always, I always wanted to be the number one of the day, you
Yeah,
know?
the Hall of Fame. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. So is there any other words of wisdom or anything else you'd like to share before we close our show?
I have no words of wisdom. I What I'm currently doing, working on right as we speak, is an experiment that is trying to replicate a method that was created by Michael Persinger, who's a well-known psychologist in Laurentian University in
Mhm.
Canada. He passed away a few years ago. So in his lab, he developed a method of magnetic stimulation that you'd put around your head that supposedly would allow two people at a distance, they'd both have this magnetic stimulator, that would allow them to have a kind of a brain-to-brain connection, a telepathic connection, which you could
Yeah.
see through the brain response of one person and in the other person. And so I'm involved in trying a replication of the technology that they developed, which would allow for this to happen. So as best as I can tell, no one outside of their laboratory has ever tried to replicate this. It's not particularly difficult to make this technology, but for reasons that maybe people thought it was a waste of time to try to replicate it because it couldn't be real. In any case, the method of creating the technology and so on, I'm right in the midst of recreating it now to see whether or not that could actually be real. Because if it is, it means we don't need to look for special people to do this brain-to-brain correlation technique of telepathy. You can basically take any two people who just happen to be wearing the same kind of magnetic stimulator. So
There's
I'll see.
there's always that question in telepathy that has always I don't have an answer for. And it makes me think, is that part of consciousness too? When, like we were talking earlier about when if you have a show, it can make it easier for the people to start understanding the possibilities of future psychic phenomena things. This is the same, I think, with UFOs and uh, whatever multidimensional beings. I don't know what the words are these days, but we've been mostly thrown at that, except for maybe ET. It's always been a fear thing that we should be afraid of an alien or we should be afraid of there being something other than what's on the earth that we know. And I feel like that's changing now also, that people are becoming a little bit more open to the possibility and maybe removing some of the fears that they've had. And I think they're trying to do things. I think, what was that one that came out? Resident Alien, where, so they're trying to, I think they're maybe progressing a little, that doesn't necessarily have to be a negative experience.
Yeah.
So I think that's in the plus. And that was just one other thing I had wanted to mention about that. And then what was the last thing? Oh, was whenever I've had my telepathy experiences with these Mongolians and Huichols and people that don't speak a word of my language and I don't speak a word of their language, and we have complete communication, I don't understand then what's happening, that no words are being exchange, that but yet we understand what they want and what I'm supposed to do. So that's something has that ever been looked at in telepathy, that the same languages are not necessary to understand each other?
Yeah. It suggests it's pre-language, that there's something within your mind or your brain that translates it into terms that you can understand consciously. But it suggests that everything being connected all of the time, whether we are aware of it or not, is simply part of something that every person knows. And so that you don't need language at that point. It's pre-language.
Oh, because, and I had wondered what was going on in the Mongolian shaman Zagda's brain when this was happening. And she had a filmmaker interview us, and that's when I got the answer. And he said, how did you communicate to Gail? You don't speak a word, and you did this for 6 days together. And she said, oh, Gail would just come inside my brain, and I would see her in there, and I would tell her what to do. So that was her description of how we did telepathy, and I thought that was a very good
Yeah.
description.
That's kind of along the lines of what the autistic kids say who are in the telepathy tapes, that their ability to speak is not very good or at all.
Right.
Yet they describe then that they get inside somebody else's head and they just get the information without actual language.
And that's all new things that are coming out now about the autistic children being very telepathic, isn't that
Yeah,
correct? And
yeah.
psychic.
So I've seen some of the experiments, the long form, like an hour long actual experiment with some of the kids. Uh, they're pretty intriguing. I mean, it kind of looks like, as best as you can tell in a video, that they actually are able to pick things up. The difficulty in most cases is that they don't have very good control. They can not only can't speak, but they can't control their body very well.
Mm.
So their ability to respond, this is not true in some cases. They can respond by typing themselves onto special kinds of type systems, and they have good control, and they still get really good results. So so I don't know. It's an area where we don't have very many experiments that have been done. Most of them are done by Diane Powell, uh, and as expressed in these telepathy tapes. So it's going to be difficult to pursue that area because of the limitations of what the kids can do and how
Mhm.
they would respond. But nevertheless, the results of uh, those trials are pretty close to 100% in figuring out what numbers and words and letters that someone else, usually the mother, not always, is thinking. And so that's so far beyond what we tend to see in laboratory studies that it really makes you wonder, well, for people who have different brains that are structured in a different way, yeah, picking it up in ways that we really don't understand at all.
Maybe their DNA is some very, very unusual DNA.
It's very likely that they would have different DNA because their whole body structure and everything else is different, and we're made up of the DNA. So yeah, so that would be an interesting area to look at too. On the other hand, if we figured that out, it's not clear that you'd want to create a genetic cocktail to produce that, because then maybe you'd end up having somebody would not be able to speak anymore.
Right.
So yeah, so there are trade-offs here.
But it's interesting, and it's great that the autistic family, the children and the families of autistic, that new research is coming up for them. So that's
Right.
also a wonderful thing.
Yeah. I
So
think that the downside in all of that is the assumption, which is kind of mentioned in the telepathy tapes podcast, is that all non-speaking autistic kids have this ability. And that's almost certainly not the case.
right.
So, at the beginning of a new kind of research line here, we need to be somewhat cautious about it. But of the few cases where I've looked at it in some detail, it looks pretty good.
It's very exciting. Well, I want to tell you one psychic intuitive moment here because it was this morning. As I dressed, I said, "What is Dean going to wear today for the show? Because I want to match him." And I put on my green top, and then I felt like it wasn't colorful, so I put a necklace over it. But I really do think that our greens are very identical, not only in being green, but being similar in color. So I just want you to know that that's why I'm wearing this. And that you're my proof that actually what I just thought ahead of time really worked. So I just want to thank you for wearing the clothing that I thought you'd be wearing today so I could match you as we sat
Yeah.
here.
I don't have any flowers or anything.
Well, no,
No.
this was an added. I felt I had to be colorful, otherwise it was just straight green like that. But then I
Yeah.
would have matched you perfect. So I want to close our show now. I feel like we've had a wonderful time here together today. And if you could just hold on for me, is there's anything else you want to say?
No.
Okay, so I want to thank you. Just hang on there. Don't leave while I close us off. I want to thank all you listeners for joining us today in this very exciting talk with Dr. Dean Radin. And I want you to remember to like, share, subscribe, comment, and remember, share your stories because remember, stories can heal. Have a great and wonderful week. Bye.